You mentioned that back in 2022 to 2023, it seemed to us that non-repayable free aid was the norm, and it was clearly the norm. We would like this approach to continue now as well. But after the new American president came to power, at first we perceived the statements that there would be no more free aid as a complete catastrophe and an absolute shock. But the Europeans reacted differently. They said, okay, we can partially purchase from the US with our own funds. And today, this looks like an absolutely effective, normal situation. Obviously, our partners have certain financial limitations and cannot just provide everything as aid, although such formats still exist. It's just that the volume and the needs are also increasing. They are not staying the same. I think that similar approaches can be implemented by other countries as well. And Ukraine, by the way, is openly discussing this with the United States. And remember, there were headlines suggesting that there could be some kind of mega deal worth $90 billion between Ukraine and the US in a military context. It won't be free either. There will also be either financial obligations or some kind of barter, including drones, including expertise, and many other things, including resources. By the way, there's also the agreement on mineral resources. So new forms of mutual understanding are emerging between the parties. Even if we're not talking about the military, but about finances, we now know that Europeans are also coming up with ways to transfer, for example, frozen Russian assets to us, and how to do this from a legal standpoint. Because they themselves don't want to raise taxes in Belgium, Germany, Italy, or any other countries, and they don't want to reduce social benefits, but supporting Ukraine is necessary. Not out of great love for us, but out of the understanding that Ukraine is buying them
time. In fact, today at the press conference with President Emmanuel Macron and President of Ukraine Volodymyr Zelensky, there was a question about the use of this very reparation loan, how France can provide it to us, and how we can use it to purchase all these systems from France, SAMP-T, Rafale, and so on. And the President of Ukraine said that he thinks he will push it through. In your assessment, at what stage are Ukraine's European partners right now? Specifically regarding the use of frozen Russian assets for this purpose, are we just at the beginning of pushing this through, or are we already approaching the finish line?
The final decision is supposed to take place in December at the meeting of the European Council. And this was stated by the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen. There will be a meeting of this institution in December. And there, in fact, the countries are supposed to reach a conclusion. By the way, she recently sent a letter about this to European leaders, in which she pointed out that there are three main instruments by which Ukraine could receive these funds. Could these be bilateral grants? Yes, from each individual EU country there could be some bilateral agreements, which is complicated, bureaucratic, and introduces a lot of different, obstacles in this process. The second is external borrowing, which Europeans can provide to Ukraine. The third is the provision of this reparations loan. By the way, there have been some positive developments here, including from France, because just the other day, the French Minister for European Affairs was asked how they see the possibility of transferring these funds to Ukraine. And they emphasized that this must be a legally flawless operation, an agreement that will not, so to speak, place this burden on the shoulders of Europeans, including France. And the discussion was about, if we frame this assistance in such a way that it is considered an advance payment, as if Russia is paying reparations, then legally everything is fine. That's why I think that even the French, who, by the way, were quite pessimistic about this issue, are changing their minds. And again, they're not doing this out of a great desire to help us, but because they don't want to take money out of their own pockets. Because if now there is an increase in spending from domestic budgets, it will affect public sentiment, impact political ratings, and the ability of certain political forces to hold on to power. That's why they're looking for the easiest way, and even though it doesn't seem easy, it's still simpler than taking money out of their own pockets and saying, we'll use it to fund the Ukrainian budget.
In the past few days, perhaps I can put it that way, just today and yesterday, while scrolling through the news feed, I came across a sort of marathon of predictions about when the war in Ukraine will end. This is obviously connected to the fact that Europeans are drafting their budgets for the coming years, and they want to understand or predict when the war will end so they can factor in certain budgetary risks. Ursula von der Leyen, President of the European Commission, she noted that the European Union anticipates that hostilities in Ukraine will continue until the end of 2026. In an interview, the president of Finland, Stubb, shared his own forecast, saying it would be the spring of 2026. In your opinion, what are these forecasts based on, aside from, some kind of financial planning for the next year?
I think it's much easier, even for their own voters, for their own society, to explain that the problems associated with this war won't drag on for decades. And what Ursula von der Leyen is saying now is clearly an appeal to European politicians who are currently very reluctant to approve any budgetary matters at all. Right now, by the way, Europeans have to vote on the long-term budget of the European Union up to 2035. And there is also a lot of uncertainty there. Everyone has their own wording. Everyone is pulling the blanket over themselves. Who gets financed? Who receives help? Who is given subsidies?
Looking at the fact that we are not part of this process, since we are supposed to join in 2030.
By the way, we are indirectly involved here because this current long-term budget also provides funding for candidates seeking to join the European Union. That's why Ukrainians have already started thinking about which programs we can fit into so that we can get support for defense, for reforms, and for similar things. But what I'm getting at is that it's very difficult to plan for the long term. That's why what Ursula von der Leyen is doing now is trying to tackle this big issue in small pieces and convince the rest of the more than 20 EU member states that such a short-term yet necessary decision needs to be made. Well, we also have a statement from the Finnish leader and Ursula von der Leyen from the United States. Last week, for some reason, Trump suddenly said, well, I think within 2 months we'll be able to deal with this war. Max,
It seems to me that we've already gotten quite accustomed to these recurring 2-day, 2-week, and now even 2-month deadlines that the White House administration continues to keep setting for us time and time again.
Yes, so in fact there are a lot of predictions. We need to focus on objective indicators. I think a really good indicator right now is the price of Russian oil. $36 per barrel, which is the lowest in many months, and this suggests that it will become more difficult for the Russian budget to receive revenue. These are good markers, but they need to persist for a certain period of time. Or, for example, the sanctions that Trump has just announced against countries that trade with Russia. And by the way, he made a loud statement about this today.
By the way, there was a reaction from the Kremlin today. They responded to it. Peskov, Putin's spokesperson, said in his usual manner, actually in the typical Kremlin rhetoric, that they will carefully study the details of this plan to introduce sanctions on Russia's trading partners, the partners of the Russian Federation.
Dragging out time is their, trump card, their ace up the sleeve.
But it probably triggered them, didn't it?
Well, listen, every time something painful happens, really, Peskov starts losing his hair. When he hears this kind of news, he comes out to the media and says, we are studying this issue very seriously, and we will, investigate. The same one who last time, after the talks about transferring Tomahawks to Ukraine, he came out with a statement saying that they are studying it very carefully, very thoroughly. This only means that there is no answer. They were simply caught off guard without any prior planning. So they are in a crisis situation, and now they have to think about how to get out of it. Because the truth is that the success of sanctions pressure on the Russian Federation lies not only in the consolidation of the Western society. It has always been on Ukraine's side anyway. There is no need to convince them. And now we see these additional commitments to support Ukraine. They understand the importance. They are with us, and we are with them. That's an axiom. But when it comes to the global south, there really are countless questions. From Latin America to African countries to many other regions. Well, there, Trump mentioned Iran first and foremost. But this cooperation is not limited to Iran. And obviously, if you take a little bit from the Indian side of these supplies to stop them, to put some pressure on China through the threat of sanctions and a bit more on some other countries, this will have a consolidated effect. But for this, systematic political will is needed. As Irina rightly said, 2-day planning is definitely not enough. Here, a system is needed, a strategy is needed, and it must be followed. Then there will be results.
In your opinion, this latest statement by Trump about sanctions, is it just words for the sake of words, or are we actually not bluffing? Right now we're warning you, and I'm telling all of you this publicly. Get ready, sanctions are coming. Or is it meant to stir up a certain wave so that Russia's counterparts on the oil market simply refuse these contracts themselves?
I think this is part of a bigger game. And it seems to me that the Russians have not stopped communicating with the Russians. Americans with Russians. They have been non-public, obviously, in recent times. We haven't seen anything official. but a whole series of events indicates that something is going on there. First, Trump says that the Russian-Ukrainian war will not affect the outside world, Europe, or anyone else, without any real basis for that, because there is currently a certain diplomatic pause between us and America. Then Trump says that we could end the war within 2 months. Then in the US, some kind of unofficial proposal appears at the UN, suggesting that the UN resolution on the annexation and occupation of Ukrainian territories by Russia be presented in a more softened, somewhat optical form. A very strange coincidence. Now, there are more statements being made. I think this is a non-public interaction, which is accompanied by certain signals that serve as markers from one side to the other. And the very fact that today Trump came out with such an antithesis to all the previous statements reassures me a little, gives me reason to believe that they haven't completely dived headfirst into this Russian propaganda, but still, at least a little. There are still some who understand that to fully accept Putin's terms means losing not only to Ukraine, but also to themselves.